there is a photograph of her that almost everyone knows. A young woman in white on a balcony, a crown, 30 million people watching on television. That is the first file. The second file sits in an archive in California. Letters sealed for decades, written to a woman named Judith Balaban Quine. Quine was one of her bridesmaids. What those letters say does not match the photograph. Today is about the gap between the two files, and about who wrote the more comfortable one. Let us start with what was public. Grace Patricia Kelly, born in Philadelphia in 1929. Her father, a self-made millionaire, a 3-time Olympic gold medalist in rowing, who never accepted acting as a real job for his daughter. She went to New York at 19, modeling, television, Broadway, then Hollywood. In 1954, Rear Window. In 1955, the Oscar for The Country Girl. By 25, she had reached everything Hollywood had to offer. That is the file everyone knows. 7 years, 11 films. Then it was over. In May 1955, a French magazine asked her to pose for a photograph with the prince of a tiny country on the Mediterranean. She agreed. The shoot filled a free day in Cannes. No one in the room knew it would rearrange the next 26 years of her life. Here I have to be careful, because from now on, the evidence and the legends blur together. Fixed figures circulate about the marriage: a dowry of $2 million, a fertility test, an outraged father. Much of it is hearsay. Rainier himself later said there had been no dowry at all. One historian notes that the sum, if it was paid at all, was likely far lower. What holds up? A marriage into the house of Grimaldi was a matter of state, not on a fairy tale. And Grace knew that earlier than the public did. Why the rush for an heir? It is written into a treaty from 1918. If a reigning prince dies without a legitimate heir, Monaco reverts to France. No heir, no country. That one sentence explains almost everything that followed. The wedding took place in April 1956. Then she moved into the palace, and the first file began to crack. Her French had gone rusty. The Monegasque nobility filed her away as a Hollywood lightweight. The staff was not hers, it belonged to Rainier. She could not walk into a cafe. She could not call a friend in Philadelphia without someone knowing about it. In the letters to Quine, she describes a loneliness she had not expected. Caroline arrived in January 1957, 9 months after the wedding. Albert in 1958, Stephanie in 1965. The contract was fulfilled, and no one in the palace had asked what an Oscar winner in her late 20s was supposed to do with the next 4 decades. In 1962, Alfred Hitchcock called. A lead role, Marnie, a psychologically complicated woman. She and Rainier agreed. The palace announced it officially. Then everything came at once. The Monegasques reacted with open hostility. Their princess was to fly to Hollywood and play a thief. And that same year, France, under de Gaulle, terminated a treaty with Monaco and threatened to choke the country economically in a tax dispute. Rainier did not want to leave the country while the crisis lasted. Grace withdrew from Marnie. Here the trail splits. Read the files closely. And it was not only about France. The crisis handed Rainier the political cover to end a project he had never wanted. In the first place, the role went to a younger actress. Grace never stood in front of a camera again. Donald Spoto, the only biographer who had access to the archive, documents. What came next? Letters describing a depression that returned in waves. several miscarriages that threw her into dark stretches. She had given up her career once, believing it was temporary. Marnie made it clear it was permanent. A tax dispute had decided for her. Now I come to the point where the second file gets forged. A whole genre of cheap biographies paints Rainier as a serial adulterer and Grace as an alcoholic. I have checked the evidence for it. It comes almost entirely from books published after 2000, resting on anonymous sources. No documented primary source carries these claims. Robert Lacey, the most balanced biographer, dismisses them. Quine, who would have known, dismisses them. What holds up is more sober. Rainier had a temper the staff learned to navigate around. He limited her travel to the United States. In the later years, the two lived in separate bedrooms, as was common in European aristocratic marriages of the period. That does not turn a difficult marriage into a nightmare. Instead of withering, Grace built something. She rebuilt the Monegasque Red Cross. She founded a children's aid organization that still operates today. She brought in the ballet, handed out grants to young artists, Americans among them. In the mid-70s, she found a way to use her own voice again. Poetry readings from 1976 in Edinburgh, arranged through her friend Gwen Robbins. For one recitation, she received an award from the BBC. Alongside that, she pressed flowers into collages that hung in galleries. This was not a woman who had given up. This was a woman who kept her voice, in the only form the palace would allow. Then, the 13th of September, 1982. She drove the 17-year-old Stephanie back from Rock Ogle to Monaco. The chauffeur had offered to drive. She declined, saying there was too much luggage for 3 people in the car. On the Moyenne Corniche, she suffered a stroke. She lost control. The car plunged more than 100 meters down. Stephanie survived. Grace did not. And now, the decisive entry. While she was already dying, the palace press office issued a statement. It spoke of broken ribs and a fractured leg. Not a word about the stroke, not a word about the brain hemorrhage. The picture of a serious but survivable accident. Less than 24 hours later, she was dead. Rainier had heard the prognosis and not accepted it. He issued the statement he could live with, not the one that was true. And when the truth caught up, the world did not only hear that Grace Kelly was dead, it heard that the palace had lied. That gap between broken ribs and dead gave birth to every conspiracy theory. That Stephanie had been driving, that the brakes had been tampered with. The mafia. None of them has any forensic foundation. All of them grew out of that one window in which the public believed 2 contradictory things. That is the story of the 2 files. The official one, smoothed down to the last sentence from the deathbed, and the other, sealed in letters never meant for the public. We still believe the first. It is the more comfortable one. It always was.